last night, or this morning, actually, when Ken asked me to introduce our speaker for the day, I said, well, I think you could do a better job than I could, but he didn't think so. But I'm so happy to tell you that I can introduce my niece this morning as our speaker. You know, they've lived away from here for so long, I feel like now that I know her better and can introduce her better than I could have a week ago. She's been here to visit, but never for 10 days have we got to spend the time together and eat most all of our meals together and our visiting together. But Susie was born in Germany, and as a young lady came here to the States for her education, and that's when she met my nephew Bill, and they got acquainted and she has been in the Hodges/Mundy family now for 52 years. So we're so happy that she's here today to speak to us, and she has written a story about their life in Germany. This is her book, A Thousand Shall Fall, and I'm thankful to see a lady visiting here today that read her book and was so interested in it that she came to hear her speak today. I'm glad you're here, Margaret, and your family. But anyway, if you haven't read Susie's book about her life, it's still available. You can get it through the Adventist Book Center, or if you don't know how to do that, just let us know and we'll get you her book. But we're happy that she's here with us today, and we're happy that Susie can be our speaker.
Amen.
As you heard, I was born and raised in Germany, and the stories I'm going to tell you this morning are stories about what God did for my family during the Second World War. And think about that. You know, the Germans were the enemies. You were the good people. We were the bad people. But God even helps the bad people. My parents were Christians, Adventists, their whole lives. When Hitler declared war, my dad wasn't supposed to be drafted anymore because he had already, as a very young man, been drafted into the First World War. And those men were exempt from being drafted, at least at the beginning of the war. But because he was an Adventist, he was drafted. You see, there was a lot of prejudice against Adventists, because what day do we keep? The seventh day. What day do the Jews keep? The seventh day. Hitler hated the Jews. His goal was to destroy all of them. And so people that kept the Sabbath were suspect from the beginning, from even before the beginning of the war. So my dad was drafted. Not even at the beginning, but the war hadn't even been declared yet. And he requested that he would be assigned as a medic because he didn't want to fight, conscientious objector. And when they asked, why do you want to be a medic? And he said, well, I believe in the Bible. I don't believe in killing people. And I'm a Seventh-day Adventist. And when they heard that, they said, oh no, you're not going to be a medic. We are going to assign you to the Pioneers Company 699. Later on, as the war progressed, that became a very famous company. 699 was the unit that was sent into enemy territory before anybody else. They got their directions directly from Hitler. And wherever he wanted to invade next with his army, he sent the Pioneers 699 first. And they were supposed to make sure that there were bridges for the army to cross because, you know, wherever the Germans wanted to invade, the countries blew up their bridges. They wanted to stop the invasions. So they were bridge builders. They had to just prepare the way for the army. But because they were always first in enemy territory, it was very dangerous. They were constantly being attacked because the other countries didn't want to be invaded by the German army. So it was a very dangerous frontline position to be in. Well, the pioneers were first sent to France when Hitler invaded France, and France wasn't prepared for an invasion, wasn't even a war at that time. They just marched in and took over. That was it. Now it's German. Then they went into Poland. Poland was a little bit more prepared, and there wasn't much of an organized army yet, but the people were fighting back. And by the time they were in Poland, my dad had been promoted in the army to be a corporal, and he was put in charge of all the paperwork for the unit. He was the one that received the orders. He was the one that had to order and receive and distribute supplies and all of these things. He had to do the bookkeeping. And he was promoted to be corporal, like I said, and because he was a corporal, he was given a choice about what weapon he would carry. And instead of carrying a regular gun, he chose to carry just a pistol. And his fellows were jealous because a pistol doesn't weigh as much as a gun. You know, oh, well, yeah. But my dad had grown up on a farm. He had learned to shoot game in the Alps. He'd gone hunting with his grandfather and shot deer and elk and animals. He was very good. And he was always a little bit afraid, even though he had promised God, I do not want to kill anybody. I believe the commandment, thou shalt not kill. I believe that's true even in war. But he was always a little bit afraid. What am I going to do if all of a sudden an enemy comes toward me with a weapon pulled and pointed at me? Won't it just be automatic for me to reach for my pistol and, defend myself? He didn't want to be forced into that position. So one day they were in a village in Poland, and he went to a carpenter shop, and on a piece of paper he drew a little drawing of, when you have a wall shelf and underneath it you have a little bracket, you have some right there. This kind of a thing. He drew a picture of this kind of a thing and said to the carpenter, I will trade you some cigarettes and some chocolate, a chocolate bar, if you will cut me out one of these things. Oh, the man was thrilled, cigarettes and chocolate. Wonderful. So my dad picked that up later in the afternoon. And then at night, he waited till everybody was asleep and it was quiet. and he checked that the fellow soldiers were all sleeping, and he snuck out and went to a little pond outside the village that he had seen earlier in the day. And while he went to the village, he pulled out his pistol, and when everything was quiet, he looked around because there were German soldiers patrolling the outskirts of the village there, and he made sure that they weren't there right then. He pulled out his pistol and threw it with all his might into the center of this pond, and it made a loud splat. And the patrols, even though they were not close by, they heard the splat, and they called to each other, "Hey, did you hear something?" They came running. My dad jumped into a ditch there and hunkered down so they wouldn't see him. And they shone their flashlights. They knew it was an unusual sound. They knew it wasn't a frog just jumping. It was louder than that. But they didn't see him. And then when they went off again, he went back into the village, pulled out this wooden bracket, and whittled it into the rough shape with his pocket knife, into the rough shape of a pistol. And then he took shoe polish and blackened it and stuck it in his holster. Didn't tell anybody. If anybody had found out that he had thrown away his weapon, he would have been executed by the Germans on the spot. No questions asked. You cannot fight and win a war without a weapon. But as they went along through Poland and then into Russia, a lot of the people in Unit 699 were killed or injured. And his lieutenant noticed that nothing ever happened to my dad. He wasn't ever hurt. And so after a few weeks, he said to my dad, "From now on, you are going to share my quarters wherever we are. You are going to be my guardian angel because I noticed that nothing ever happens where you are." And so that's what happened. So my dad had a little bit of better quarters always as they went along. And then I'm going to jump ahead to the end of the war, tell you the rest of the story. During the 6 years of the war, there were 1,200 people originally there were 1,200 people in that unit of the pioneers. During the war, the 6 years, there were so many soldiers killed and injured that that 1,200 had to be replaced 3 times. So 3,600 men. Of the original 1,200 that had been drafted from the city of Frankfurt, where we lived at the time, there were only 7 that survived to the end of the war. My dad was one of the 7. Never an injury, never anything to him. And then at the end, they were all told, if you reach this border in Austria, a certain river, a bridge across a river, if you reach this river and can cross it before a certain time, a certain day, you will become American prisoners of war. If you don't make it across this bridge, you will be Russian prisoners of war. Well, all the Germans wanted to be American prisoners of war because the Russians had a horrendous reputation for cruelty. But I want you to understand something. The Germans had killed 20 million Russian soldiers and people No wonder they were angry and cruel. Anyway, all the German army, and the pioneers included, rushed back to reach that bridge. And the pioneers reached it just shortly before, just a little while, an hour or so before the deadline. And they went across the bridge, and there were American soldiers standing there, and they just pointed to two big piles, weapons, ammunition, and all the Germans, as they streamed across, the German soldiers threw their weapons over here, the ammunition here, and they were so glad to be rid of it. You know, it was a horrible war, a horrible war. The German people did not want that war. It was Hitler who wanted that war and who wanted to rule the world. Well, my dad pulled out his weapon, his pistol, and threw it on this pile, and his lieutenant, who also was one of the 7 who survived, because, you know, my dad had been his guardian angel. Of course he survived. He saw this wooden thing on the pile, and he said, "What is that thing?" And my dad said, "It's a piece of wood. That's what I carried all during the war." And the lieutenant looked at him and he said, "And you were my guardian angel?" He made it without a weapon. God was with him. God protected him. Now, in many ways, it was very, very difficult for my dad. Naturally, he was constantly in danger. And he was also an Adventist, and it was difficult to be an Adventist in Germany, whether you were in the army or at home. But in many ways, life was much more difficult for my mother. Back in Germany, in Frankfurt, with 3 little children. I wasn't born yet. Because she was responsible not just for herself, but for her children. And that it was a constant struggle, constant accusations that they were hidden Jews and they needed to be arrested and they needed to be persecuted. One day, my mother received a letter on a Friday. And it was a big official envelope, and she thought, "What is this now?" She opened it up, and it was from the Nazi Party headquarters in Frankfurt. And it was an order for her to appear at headquarters on Monday morning. Well, that was very, very bad news. Headquarters was in downtown Frankfurt, in a brown building, and it was known as the Brown House, and it had a very bad reputation because it was known that people who were ordered to go there and appear for whatever reason, most of them never came back, and nobody knew where they went. They didn't know, were they executed or, nobody knew. Well, on Sabbath, my mother and the children went to church, and there was, between services and before services, there was a lot of whispering with different church members, and then they had a special prayer for her, like, you asked for special prayer. Keep Sister Hazel safe when she goes to headquarters. On Monday morning, she said to the children, "Today you don't go to school." We lived in a big apartment building. You stay in the apartment, but you have to be really quiet so the neighbors don't know that you are here, because anything that we did, the neighbors were spying on us. They were constantly trying to find something that they could report on us. She said, you have to be quiet. You cannot flush the toilet. You cannot make any noise. Just quietly sit and read books so that nobody knows that you are at home. Don't move around. And then she called each of the 3 children into the bedroom by themselves, and she gave them instructions. You see, she had made arrangements with church members that if in case she didn't come back from her appointment at the Brown house, that the church members would take care of the children, but not all 3 of them together, separately. In case one of them would be caught, the others might be safe. And she only told each child what was relevant to them. She didn't tell them what the plans were for the brother and sister, so that if one of them was caught and they were tortured, they couldn't give the other 2 away because they didn't know. But it was arrangements like, okay, you take such and such a streetcar and you go to this stop, and then you get off and you change into a bus, quite complicated, involved directions. And then you get off at such and such a place, and there will be somebody there waiting for you, and they will take you and hide you, one of the church members. So the children were terrified, you can imagine. My mother went to town, knocked on the door, rang the bell on the Brown house. She heard the bell ringing. Somebody opened the door and she said, what do you want? Well, she showed the letter, I have an appointment here. And said, oh, yes, come on in. She stepped in, and then she heard a funny click. She turned around and she saw that the door had fallen, closed behind her, which was normal. But on the inside, that door did not have any doorknobs. So once you were in, you couldn't get out unless they let you out with a key. And the man there at the entrance said, okay, just go on upstairs, go up the steps. He's already waiting for you. The director of the party in Frankfurt, in that district. And my mother was afraid. She was shaking. She could hardly breathe. She was holding on to the railing going upstairs. And then when she was about a little ways up, all of a sudden she felt a peace coming over her, just a peace. And she felt like she was surrounded by angels. She didn't see anyone, she didn't see anything, but she felt calm. And so she stepped into the man's office, knocked on the door and stepped in. And he said, oh, Frau Hasel, you are here. Have a seat. So she sat down. It was a big, imposing desk, and he sat behind it. And he said, do you know why I ordered you to come here? And she said, no, I have no idea. And he said, you wrote a letter to your husband who is in the army. And you said that you were not getting food ration cards anymore. Do you remember writing this letter? She said, yes, I wrote this letter. And he said, don't you know that it is illegal to write bad news to the soldiers at the front? Because if all the families wrote about the bad things that were going on at home, they would lose their courage. They couldn't fight anymore. It is illegal to do that. And my mother said, I didn't know it was illegal, but what am I supposed to do? I can't feed my children anymore. You see, they started withholding food ration cards because she was an Adventist and kept Sabbath. And you couldn't buy food without cards, without rations. So he said, why don't you get your rations? And she said, well, you see, I'm a Seventh-day Adventist, and we keep the Sabbath. And because we keep the Sabbath, the people are suspicious that I'm a Jew, and they started withholding. And he didn't even let her finish. He said, oh, you are a Seventh-day Adventist. He picked up the phone, called somebody, some secretary or somebody, and said, would you check and make sure that Frau Hasel is a member of the Seventh-day Adventist Church? And shortly a phone call came back confirming that she was a member. The Nazis, that was before computers. That was before telephone books. We didn't have a telephone till 20 years after that time. But the Nazis knew everything about everybody. So he said, well, I tell you something. I have high regards for the Adventist Church. My mother about fell off her seat. The party leader, the party director in Frankfurt had high regards for the Adventist Church. It was impossible. It was unheard of. And he said, you see, what happened is I and my family, we lived in Frankfurt in the center, and we were bombed. Frankfurt during the war was 80% destroyed. All of you have seen pictures this week of the wildfires in California. By the way, they were very close to where we live, 15 miles away. And how whole neighborhoods were destroyed, burned up. Well, that's what Frankfurt looked like, destroyed. And he said, we were bombed out, and we had to evacuate into one of the suburbs. And they put us in an apartment that was available. You know why there were apartments available? Because they had taken the Jews out and put them in concentration camps, and all their housing was available. And he said, you know what? There's a man in your church that lives next door to us. And he said, do you know Mr. So-and-so? And my mother said, yes, I know him. He was the elder of the church. And he said, and my mother thought, the elder of the church lives next to the party boss? He's never said a word about that. This is the weirdest thing. But he said he was so nice to us. They brought us food. They gave us blankets. They just helped us so much, and I have high regard for them. And my mother just stunned, because she knew nothing about that. So he said, I tell you what, you go back home, and I will make sure that you get your ration cards back. And so she stood up and she said, oh, and there was a big name plate on the desk. And she said, thank you so much, Herr Springer. That was his name. I just appreciate you doing that to me. I am so grateful. And he looked at her and he said, oh, I am not Herr Springer. He said, you know what? Herr Springer got sick last night. He was very sick. He had the flu. He was throwing up and had diarrhea all night, and he called me this morning. He couldn't come today, so I'm taking his place. Well, all of a sudden, my mother, started understanding why she hadn't heard anything about this. Anyway, she left. She went home. The children were still sitting there quiet as mice, and she said, let's kneel down and thank the Lord. He has saved us. A couple of days later, she got her ration cards in the mail, not only her current ration cards, but all the back ones that they had withheld. After the war, at the end of the war, when the Americans came in, it became known that there was from the Brown House an underground secret passage that had been dug, a tunnel that went to the prison. And people that went there usually were put in the prison and then shipped to concentration camps. That's why they never came back. But God opened the doors. And my mother walked out unharmed. Now, my dad, in the meantime, had been moved. The pioneers had been moved. They had marched through Russia and into Ukraine. And one night they were stationed in a small town that was an important railroad junction where trains went in different directions of the country. And they all went to bed, they slept in a big barn there, went to bed and to sleep. And in the morning, my dad roused up because he thought there was a thunderstorm. He heard this thunder, what he thought was thunder. And when he woke up, he realized it wasn't thunder because it was continuous. So he quickly jumped up. They always slept in their clothes. There was just one road still open. So he ran down, ran across the street, ran into the barn and said, get up, the Russians are coming. And everybody jumped up and he said, there's this road that's still open. Get going as fast as you can. They left everything behind. Jumped, got out to their vehicles, the trucks and the jeeps, whatever they had, cranked them up, jumped on, and drove out. Well, my dad was remember I told you, the company clerk. He was responsible for all the secret orders from Hitler. He couldn't just leave them behind. His orders were, if the enemy approaches, you need to burn these. Well, there wasn't time to burn anything. He had all this stuff in a little feed room off the barn. So he ran there quickly. There wasn't time to do anything, wasn't time to grab it or anything. He ran there. He closed the door, didn't have a lock on it, and with a piece of chalk just drew a skull and crossbones, which usually means danger or poison or something, and then ran outside, and the last truck pulling a trailer was just pulling out. And he ran behind it. Nobody had noticed that he was still in there. He ran behind and he couldn't make it onto the truck, but he made it onto the connecting bar between the truck and the trailer, and he jumped up on the bar and held on for dear life, sitting there, saying, Lord, thank you for saving my life. And off they went as fast as they could go. Well, this was, while he was praising the Lord, this was a wonderful thing. But they came to a curve. And when they came to the curve, it went like this. So he was sitting there in the middle. And when that truck started turning, it pushed him off of that bar he was sitting on. And he fell down in such a way that his head was just in front of the front wheel of the trailer, just about to touch him. And all he had to do, he tells that in just a split second, and you may have heard or read this from other people who have been in life-threatening situations, their life rolls off before them like a movie. They see their whole life flashing by in a moment. And he said, I saw my whole life from that moment to the time when I was 3 years old, just flashing by. And the tire was touching my head right here, and all I had time to do was close my eyes and say, Lord, save me. And just then, something grabbed him by the back of the uniform jacket, pulled him out of there, lifted him up, and sat him down on top of the trailer. And when he opened his eyes and looked around, there was no one there. And he knew that had been an angel. And he started singing songs of praise. And the other soldiers that were in the truck and in the bed of the truck with a tarp, down, these army trucks, they stuck their heads out because they didn't know that he had been left behind. And they saw him sitting back there and they said, what is going on? So he told them the whole story of what had happened. Well, somehow the German army found out about this, and they sent reinforcements and airplanes that drove the Russian tanks back. And so by afternoon, the pioneers were able to drive back into the town. And my dad thought, dear Lord, you saved my life in a wonderful way. But if I walk into this barn and the Russians have taken my papers and Hitler's orders, I will be executed and my life will be lost all the same. So he didn't know what would happen. They walked into the barn, and all their possessions that they had left behind, their packs, their everything was just destroyed. The Russians had gone in there, they had, with their bayonets, had slit open everything, they had trampled stuff, they had torn it to shreds. And my dad walks to his little feeding alcove thing there with a wooden door without a lock. And he thought, oh, what will I find in there? He opened the door and nothing in there had been touched. The papers were all there intact. He had even received the soldiers' pay the day before in the mail. It had been delivered to the pioneers there. He hadn't even had time to pass it out to the soldiers yet. And even all the money was in there. Nothing had been touched. God, who can close the lion's mouth, certainly can keep a wooden door closed. He did. Now, my mother, toward the end of the war, not just my mother, Germany suffered much from hunger. The farms didn't produce much food. The men were all gone. Either they were in the army or they had been killed already. Nobody was growing stuff. The whole distribution system for food had broken down. And my mother ran out of food. She had just a little piece of bread left one day. And by that time, I was already born. So one day she said to the children, there is no help for it, but I'm going to have to leave you here by yourself. And there is enough bread that each of you can have a slice of bread. Don't eat it all at once. Save it carefully. Eat just a little bit at a time. I'm going to leave tomorrow early in the morning. I'm going to take a train into the country where she had some friends, some farmer friends. And I'm going to see if I can beg some food. And then tomorrow I will come back. And she said, be careful with the bread. Take care of the baby. And then in the morning she took off. It was in the winter time, it was snowing. And she got into the little village outside Frankfurt right in the evening. And she went, knocked on the door, and the farmer's wife opened the door, and she said, Frau Hasel, what are you doing here in the snow, in the winter? Come in. And my mother said, Frau Joost, I don't have any bread. I don't have any food. We can get no food in the city. Could you give me a little bit of food? And she said, of course we'll share with you. And so the lady put together little bits, some bread and a little bit of butter. And she said, I tell you what, I'll go around to all the neighbors in the village, and if everybody gives a little bit, you will have plenty of food. And sure enough, by the time she got back that evening, my mother had a backpack on, and that was full of food, and 2 bags, flour and honey and some eggs and bread and stuff that you have on a farm. And she was so grateful. She went to bed. And the next morning she got up early because she had to walk to the train station. There wasn't a station in that village. She had to walk to a different village to even catch the train back. And when she woke up and got up, Frau Joost said, Frau Hasel, you cannot go to the train station. It has been snowing all night. The snow is quite high, and even the snow plow, drawn by horses, hasn't been able to get through yet. So you just go back to bed and stay warm and stay here. And my mother said, I can't do that because my children don't have any food left. And there's the baby, and I need to take care of the baby. And she said, if I can't go on, she had planned to go. The milkman came around in the morning and collected the milk from the farmers. She had planned to ride with him on his wagon to the train station. Well, he wasn't going. She said, if the milkman can't go, I have to walk. I cannot stay here. And so she started out walking. The snow was almost up to her knees. It was so deep. And she had, of course, this heavy load. And it was hard going. You know what? In California, we don't have snow. But here you do. You know probably what it's like to walk in deep snow. I don't. When we have a tiny bit of snow, once a winter maybe, like a half an inch or something, just as all the schools close so the children can have a snow day. And the children go in the yards and scratch together the snow and make a little snowman on a picnic table about this tall. That's the snow we have. But this was deep snow like you have in the mountains. And she got so tired and she got so hot. And finally, she was walking on this country road and there were milestones every so often. And they were tall, like sort of knee-high, maybe a little higher even. And she thought, I'm just going to stop here and rest a little bit. I am so worn out. And she said, I'm not going to sit down because I am afraid I'll freeze to death if I sit down. She was smart. She said, I'm just going to stand here and lean against this milestone. And she put her backpack, just rested it on top and put the 2 bags down. And she just leaned there and closed her eyes and rested a little bit. But she fell asleep anyway, standing up. Didn't matter. And she started feeling all warm and comfortable and started dreaming. And in her dream, she felt like there were angels swirling around her. It was still snowing while she was walking along. And it got all mixed up. And all of a sudden, she roused up because she heard a motor. And she opened her eyes. She was all stiff, but she opened her eyes and she looked and she saw that a truck was coming along the road very slowly in the deep snow. And she thought, this is my salvation. She waited till it got closer and then she was wanting to wave her hands. And she was all covered in snow. She looked like a snowman. And when she tried to raise her hands, she couldn't move her arms. She was so stiff. She couldn't do anything. So she just watched it go by and she said, Lord, this man could have saved me. Why didn't you help me? And then she sort of drifted back to sleep. She was half gone, you know. Well, a little while later, somebody took her by the shoulder and shook her and said, lady, wake up, wake up. And he shook her with all his might. And she roused up again and he said, what are you doing here? And it turned out that it was the truck driver. He had seen her, but he didn't want to stop there at the bottom of the hill. He thought he'd never get started again. So he drove to the top of the hill and then walked down to her. It was easier to do because he had left the tracks, you know, from driving. And she said, well, I live in Frankfurt and I have these children and we don't have any food and I came here to beg for food and now I'm trying to get back home. And he said, where are you trying to go? She said, I'm trying to go to the train station. He said, I can tell you this. All the trains are patrolled. And if they find food in your possession, it's all going to be confiscated because it is against the law for people individually to try to get food. They coined a whole word in German to describe that process of secretly trying to collect food. It was called to hamster. You know how hamsters go and stuff their cheeks? He said, to hamster is forbidden by the law because the German government, whatever, Hitler or whatever, they wanted to make sure that whatever little food there was evenly distributed, which was a good plan, only it didn't work. Especially in the big cities, there wasn't food coming in. And she said, what am I going to do? My children are starving. They ate their last slice of bread. And he said, I tell you what, lady, just get in the truck and I'll take you home. So she climbed in the truck. He lifted her bags in the truck, put them in the back of the truck. She was in the cab. And he said, here, I have a thermos with hot tea. Go drink that. So she took that and she felt so much better. And he said, I'll turn the heat up. And he did. And they slowly went up the hill. And she started looking at him. And he was just a regular farmer, you know, hard, calloused hands and dirty fingernails. Obvious that he was working in the soil. And he wasn't very talkative. And she tried to talk to him, and the only thing he said, well, I never come this way. You are just so fortunate today I came this way. I never come this way. And she fell asleep again. She was so exhausted. And when she woke back up, they were just driving into the suburb in front of our apartment building where we lived. And my mother thought, I don't even remember telling him our address. That's interesting. Maybe I did tell him and I don't remember it. So he said, well, here we are. And she got out, stepped out, and then she thought, uh-oh, he has my food in the back. Now I can tell my food goodbye. But no, he got out and got her bags out, set them down beside her, and she turned around and put the backpack on her shoulders. And then she was going to turn around to say goodbye and wave goodbye. And when she turned around, the truck was gone. And then she looked on the ground. There were no tracks in the snow. That was an angel. God sent his angel, just like our memory text, our Bible text this morning said. God sent his angel to protect our feet from stumbling. Now, I want to say something here real briefly. I have heard the family has been talking about different people, and I know some of you, and I know that all of you have gone through hard times of a different nature, and God has not solved them in wonderful ways all the time. He did wonderful things for us, not because we are better people, but he did it, and he does it to people sometimes so that we know that he's able to do it. Now, there is a text in Ephesians 3, and this is from the Message Bible, and I just love the way that reads. It says, God can do anything, far more than you could imagine or guess or request in your wildest dreams. And that's what the thought I want to leave with you today, to strengthen your faith, your hope, and your courage.
Wow, did you receive a blessing today? I certainly